Alright, this is part 2 of the DNS scenario situation section of the DNS lessons. Part 1, we covered split horizon DNS and split brain DNS and how to deal with those scenarios. Go watch part 1 if you want to know what that is. I'm not going to recap it because I want to make this a little bit more concise. In this video, we are going to be talking about Windows DNS load balancing. There's two options. There's round robin, which is the one that's been around forever, and then there is DNS policies now, which are available through PowerShell, and they're new, I think, with Server 2022, or at least they've been new in the last couple of years. I don't know if they're 2019 or not. So let's switch back quick to our desktop. Here's our copy of our current DNS zone. We've got 3 servers stood up for this lab. We've got an Active Directory server, app P1 on a 10.2 subnet, and a management one on 10.01 subnet. And the very first load balancing method in Windows we're going to talk about is round robin. This one is really simple. Round robin is literally just the DNS server takes turns going through the list of records with the same name and gives the next IP address in the list. So in this case, we're going to we're going to add a record with the same name and 2 different IP addresses, and you'll watch when we ping it, it's going to give one response, then the other, and then it will go back and forth between the list. To get this to work, there are a couple of components. The first thing you have to do is go into the properties of your DNS server itself and go to Advanced and make sure you have Enable Round Robin selected here, because without that it's not going to work. It is by default, so chances are you've already got it configured. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to change our view to Advanced. And that's specifically so we can adjust the TTL on the DNS records themselves. TTL, if you need a reminder, is how long the DNS records are cached for by default. I'll talk about that in a second. So we are going to use round robin DNS balancing on a fake record called LB for load balance. So I'm going to do a new record. Type in LB. That's going to give us lb.dzab.local for our domain. And I'm going to use 2 different IP addresses. The first one is the management server we're on. And going back to that TTL thing, I'm going to set the TTL on this record for LB to 0, meaning this record, if the client respects it, this record will not be cached anywhere. And what this means is every time we look on that record again, it's going to not reference the cache record. It will always check for the new updated record. So we're going to add that host, and you'll notice it keeps the TTL at 0, but we're going to add the same name and then use our second IP address, which is going to be for our app P1 server. And you don't, to make this work, I could just have blank IP addresses in there, but I want to be able to do a ping result or ping test and get a live result. So I'm going to do that, and that's it. So now we have 2 records. Both are named LB, but they have 2 different IP addresses. And the way round robin works is client is going to query the DNS server. It's going to respond 10.1. This next client is going to query the DNS server. It's going to respond 10.2. And in my testing, this does appear to be based on the client's pinging the DNS server, not the DNS record itself being cached on the client. Meaning, right now I am on the management server. Yep, management.p1. So when I ping for this name, it's always going to give me the same result because the DNS server is going to say this client gets 10.01, and the next client that connects is going to get the next result. So to make for the demonstration, what I'm going to do is enter a PowerShell session on another server. So now we're connected and running from app P1, and I'm running this from management.p1. So ping lb.dzab.local. I get 10.01, which is the same first record for the list. Now I'll go over here. Again, this is running from a different server, app.p1. Ping lb.dzab.local. And I get 10.2. Different record. And that's how it works. Round robin's really simple. It literally just goes down the list in order. So you can have as many of these records as you want. You could have 2, 5, 10. It just continues to cycle through each record. So it's kind of a very simple load balancing method that just uses the next client connecting. Not very advanced, but it works. So let's close these and close this. And the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to connect to domain controller. And we are going to configure DNS policies. Now, these are new. Based on my research, these only work, or they only have PowerShell commands. There is not a method yet of doing this in the console. But what we're going to do, you can kind of see it in the steps here. So I'm going to create a new zone. This represents, let's just say, an external website. And then what I'm going to do in steps is I'm going to specify 2 different subnets that clients can be coming from. So this is where the client that's attempting to do a DNS lookup is originating from. And I've got my 2 subnets here that I use in other demonstrations. I got 10.0.1 for servers, and I have 10.0.2, which represents a remote site. It's just 2 separate subnets. Then I'm going to add what's called a DNS server zone scope. And what that is separating out a DNS zone and giving you another view of that zone. So the scope in this case, it allows you to set different IP addresses to the same records in the same zone. So here I'm just adding 2 scopes. I have a scope for servers and I have a scope for remote. And the next step after that, I'm adding the same record to those 2 different zones. So in this case, it says add DNS resource record. So I'm adding an A record for www at this IP address to the dzab.test zone. But the additional parameter here is the zone scope. For 10.0.1, I'm adding it to the server scope on the dzab.test zone. And the next one, I'm adding it to the same zone, but I'm adding it to the remote scope. So zone scopes are like 2 separate views of the same zone, or multiple views. You can have as many zone scopes as you want. And then the last section here, what I'm doing is creating the actual query resolution policy. Now this is what actually controls the action of looking up the records. So what I'm doing here to walk you through it is, it's a server policy. I am saying if the client subnet equals server subnet, and this goes back to the subnets we created up here. So if the client subnet is in the server subnet, then use the zone scope servers on the zone dzab.test. So that's kind of going through each step. So let's go ahead and run these in command and see how it works. So first thing I want to do, I haven't actually ran these live yet, so I'm hoping it just works. I'm going to add a primary zone. Okay. Let's see if I can do this in the console instead. Only because I didn't look up these commands. I haven't tested this yet, so we're doing this live. It's exciting. New zone. All right. New primary zone, AD integrated, all domain controllers, dzab.test. All right. Cool. This doesn't really matter because we're not doing updates to this. And refresh. All right, dzab.test. So I've got my zone. Now let's try adding our subnets. So I've got my server subnet, which is 10.0.1, and I've got my remote subnet, which is 10.0.2. And just as a reminder, if we look at our clients, my Active Directory server is on 10.0.0, my management server is on 10.0.1, and my app.py is on 10.0.2. So I have actual clients in each subnet. Now that I've specified my potential client subnets, I'm going to come in here and add my zone scopes to the zone dzab.test. So do that and that. Now I've got my 2 zone scopes. And just out of curiosity, I'm wondering if I can do git DNS server zone scope for dzab.test. And there you go. So it looks like by default every zone is given a zone scope that matches the name of it, and then we've got the 2 zone scopes that we added here. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is create A records in each zone. and these A records are going to be for www. So what this will allow us to do is query www.dzab.test in the individual zone scopes. So let's go ahead and run these. Now I've created 2 A records, and the very last thing I'm going to do is run my policies. As a reminder, this is going to say if your client subnet's in the server subnet 10.0.1, then you get to get the zone scope servers, which has 10.0.1 record. Otherwise, if your client's in the remote subnet, then you get the zone scope remote. Let's go ahead and create those. Is enabled true, action allow. It looks like we are good to go. 1 second here. I got a Teams message I have to respond to. Okay, so now that those are created, let's do this. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to enter a PS session so I don't actually have to connect to that other server. It'll be just like running commands from it anyways. Okay, so I have my command prompt that's running from my management server, and as a reminder, this management server is in 10.0.1.4, 10.0.1, which lines up with the zone scope server subnet. So I should be getting, based on my policy, the result from the server scope, which is 10.0.1. So I'm going to do ping www.dzab.test, and I get 10.0.1. If I go to my app server, which ipconfig is 10.0.2, and I ping the same thing, it gives me 10.0.2 as a response. So that tells us our policies of mapping. If my client is in the 10.0.2 subnet, then return the remote subnet scope, or the record in the remote subnet scope for dzab test. If my client is in the 10.0.1 subnet, then return the record from the server scope of dzab.test. And we've got 3 scopes. Now, ironically, if I go back to this other server, so this is running from my AD server, if I just ping the same thing, www.dzab.test, I would expect this isn't going to work because we never actually created a record for the regular zone. Couldn't find it. So if I copy this, and all I'm doing is I want to, actually I don't need a policy, I just need, I'm going to say, okay, so I'm going to say for the dzab test, if you ping www and you're in the default zone, I want you to return 10.0.2. So run that, and now if I ping this again, 10.0.2. There you go. So that's this kind of goes over the gist of how Windows DNS policies work globally, because to do like global server load balancing, which is based on like public IPs, they want you to go and map whole subnets to their different regions. You have to do that manually, but this policy can be extrapolated to any degree or any size, intended to be handled globally. But as long as you're using Windows DNS servers, there's the policies that you can use to load balancing. Like I said, these are new, but they do mirror pretty closely what you can get out of some load balancers. But our next video that we're going to talk about for DNS is actually going to be talking about some of the more advanced global server load balancing you can get with NetScalers and the DNS protocol. We're going to go into a little bit more depth about the DNS protocol itself, just to talk about, what is available from a DNS server's perspective to even use for load balancing, because the DNS protocol itself is pretty simple, so there's limited options on how you can balance and respond with different DNS records based on just what's supplied in the request. So that will be in the next video. I hope this one was good for you and made sense. Thanks.